Stay hungry, stay foolish.
Today's book is about why people want what they want. It's based on the notion that, in the end, we will either be masters or slaves of our desires, and that we can choose the outcome. True freedom, our guest argues, is the freedom to want what is best for ourselves and for others. The ability to desire in a healthy way is not something we're born with, but a freedom we must earn. It's a great pleasure to welcome author of Wanting, The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life, Luke Burgis. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Aidan, thanks for having me, man.
It's fantastic to have you on the show. I was telling you just before we came on how I absolutely enjoyed the book. I had an extra 3 days because I recorded last week's show a bit early, which was great because I got through it and I took my time, which is don't usually have the luxury of that time. For our audience, I have a copy up for grabs. Just sign up to theinnovationshow.io and you will be in with a chance of winning today's fantastic book. So Luke, you tell us at the start a little bit about your backstory because it's very important about how you got into this mimetic desire, which we'll get into in a sec. But you talk about how you spent your 20s starting companies, chasing the entrepreneurial dream that Silicon Valley enshrined in the 90s. Then something odd happened when one of the companies you had founded collapsed, and rather than grieve, you experienced intense relief. That was when you realized you hadn't found anything at all, and your previous successes had felt like failures, but now failure felt like a success. I loved how you phrased that, and it teases up beautifully for your backstory.
I left the corporate world. I left a job on Wall Street, a great job on Wall Street, to go found a company in Silicon Valley in my early 20s. And I somehow had this idea that this was going to bring me some degree of freedom, that I would just be free. I'd be my own boss and CEO. I could do everything my own way. And it turned out that I ended up being more of a slave than ever before as a startup founder. And what I was a slave to were, the mimetic forces. And we'll get to that word later. But I was a slave to my own desires and my own misunderstandings about what it was that I wanted. And I ended up feeling less free than ever before. So I started a series of companies. Some had great success. One was a massive failure. One I just got totally bored with. And I got to a point in my late 20s where I was like, what is going on here? Like, I'm more miserable than ever when everybody's telling me that I should be happy. I had some financial freedom. I was able to craft a lifestyle in any way that I wanted, quite frankly. Yet I was totally miserable. And one of the reasons I was miserable was because I had lost enduring enthusiasm and desire. I would get really excited about something one day and then not be excited about it the next, whether that was a girl or whether it was a company or whether it was like a new hobby that I'd just taken up. So I was kind of like a real dilettante, just having experiences, traveling all over the world, starting things, and then becoming disillusioned. And one of the stories that I tell in the book is about, I had a blow up of a business deal. And when the deal blew up, I thought it was definitely what I wanted. And it blew up, and this was a financial disaster for me. So there's nothing good about this in the moment. And I was mortified, and I did grieve for a few minutes. But one of the interesting things about our culture is we don't grieve very well. But that's a whole nother story that I won't get into. But I grieved for just a short period of time. And after that little period of shock and awe that I went through, this intense feeling of relief just washed over me. I was at dinner at an Italian restaurant, and I felt this sense of enormous freedom. And I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. But what it was the freedom of not having to go after and strive for these goals that I ultimately didn't even care about. To turn my company into a certain kind of company that got written up in a certain business publication, things like that, or just starting. I ended up getting into business lines in my company that I didn't even want to be in. I just went where the money was, and eventually wasn't happy or proud of the work that I was in. So without the business deal blowing up, I think that if that hadn't happened, I would have continued down a certain path for, I mean, God knows how long, right? It might have been 9, 10, 11, 12 years without the realization. So the blow up took on the appearance of a great gift for me, in that it set me free from these certain chains that I wouldn't have been able to free myself from. And, often in my life, that's the way that things have worked. Things happen to me that are, perhaps I don't fully understand them at the time, but then I go through a process and I look back and I'm like, there's learning and growth that can come from that. And I was disrupted in the best possible way that allowed me to make the change that I didn't even know I needed to make.
The language you use in the book is clear that you've read widely and deeply, going right back to the roots of writing as well, which you do. But I'm doing this thing with my kids at the moment. I read them a couple of pages of the Greek myths at nighttime, and it's a real selfish thing for me to do, because I'm enjoying it as much as them, because I'm reading back in the past. And I love, in particular, I did my college thesis in French on Le Mythe de Sisyphe, the myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. And it really came to mind in that striving that you were constantly pushing the boulder up the hill, and then it would come back and crush you over again every time you reached the top of the hill. So instead of getting to the other side and discovering freedom, it just rolled back on you and again. And I loved how you phrased this similar thing. You said, a mentor once suggested that you look at a set of ideas that would explain why you'd come to want all the things that you wanted, and how your wanting so easily entrapped you in cycles of passion followed by disillusionment, that Sisyphus effect. And the source of those ideas was a fairly obscure but influential academic, one I'd never heard of, René Girard, known as the new Darwin of the social sciences. And this was a breakthrough moment for you and your thinking, and what ultimately gave us this book. Yeah,
well, I'm glad you mentioned Sisyphus, because I almost named that section of the book like My Sisyphean Adventure or something like that, and I changed it. And Camus says at the very sort of end of his reflection, one must imagine Sisyphus happy to have to continue doing this. And I don't quite agree with that, because I do think there's a way to not have to push the boulder to the top of the mountain over and over and over again. So René Girard, and your French pronunciation is far better than mine. So René Girard.
I lived there for a long time.
So René Girard was a French academic who came to the States shortly after World War II. And ended up staying in the U.S. his whole life. He originally was at Indiana University. He went to Johns Hopkins, and he landed at Stanford, where he was a mentor to some pretty famous people, one of them being Peter Thiel, who's a co-founder of PayPal. Girard's background was in history. He got his PhD in history, but he was an autodidact. So he ended up studying philosophy, sociology, science, theology, you name it. I mean, he was just very widely read, classical literature. There's a lot of very smart people out there. Smart people are a dime a dozen. But Girard was able to think differently, I think, in part because he just drank from so many different wells and so many different sources, and he had this unique ability to put it all together and see insights that people that are super siloed sometimes miss in their very own discipline. So Girard's fundamental insight into the nature of human desire was something that philosophers had missed for thousands of years. Aristotle had noted that humans are the most imitative creatures in the world. Our powers of imitation are far greater than any animal, even the great apes. They don't even come close to the imitation powers of a human infant. But they'd never realized that the imitation goes deeper than the surface level of imitation. We all know that we imitate, and that's how we know language. It's how we adopt cultural norms. It's how we grow. We imitate facial gestures. If we don't do that, we kind of have awkward social interactions. So this is pretty common knowledge. But what Girard put his finger on is that our imitation goes to the level of desires. We actually imitate the desires of other people. And in fact, this is the primary mode of human wanting, because after our basic needs are fulfilled, which we don't necessarily need to imitate anybody to fulfill those basic needs. I mean, if I'm dying of thirst in the desert and I see water, I have an instinctual response to go to that water and drink. Same with hunger, same with coldness and warmth. So we have an instinctual basis for many of our needs. But in the realm of desire, we're talking about abstract things. We're talking about stocks. We're talking about lifestyles. We're talking about careers and body image and all of these kinds of things. Girard's insight was that we look to other people all the time. These other people are basically models of desire for us. And usually at a preconscious or subconscious level, we take cues from them about what's important and what's desirable. And we imitate their desires without necessarily knowing that we're doing it. And these other people render things more or less desirable for us. And we convince ourselves that, it's just us, that like I'm hyper rational, I think I'm smart, and I've chosen, to pursue this thing based on merely its objective qualities. And it could be true that, there are certain things out there because they're beautiful, because they're true or whatever, like that I'm more attracted to them on some level. But I'm usually not accounting for the models of desire and the way that they heavily influence the way that I perceive these objects and the way that I choose objects to pursue. So I'll stop there because as you know, there's a lot here.
Yeah, there's so much. We're only getting started. It dawned on me that I often talk about different types of innovation in that there's one where you're a painter and the painter, you've a blank canvas and you're create. So it's kind of invention. But then there's one where you're a sculptor and that involves taking away. So you're improving a process or taking away some friction for the customer. But the mental model I got when I was reading was, you're not telling us to do anything to build. What you're actually telling us to do is take stuff away, and also almost like we're the block of wood that needs to be sculpted to find out who we truly are and what really drives us. But I pulled a quote here that beautifully expresses this, and also expresses actually one of the reasons I was so keen to have you on the show, because you're a contrarian in your world. So as a startup founder, as a successful one, as one that's had the failures and recovered from them, that's a great model for society. But you've gone the other way and gone, don't follow me. And you say here, it's hard to be a contrarian. It's even harder to take contrarian action, to question the dominant narrative, to be honest with yourself, to tell the truth, even when the immediate outcome is pain. I loved what you said there, because that will resonate. It resonated hugely with me, but it also resonates with so many of our audience who are those people who are either on their journey towards being the contrarian or else are getting there in some way.
Yeah. So, being a contrarian is kind of almost a trendy thing to be these days. There's some pretty popular contrarians. So it's easy to kind of, tweet things out and kind of have a persona where you're kind of constantly, being the antagonist and having contrarian views. But I came upon a situation early in my life where to be a contrarian, I had to have skin in the game, and there was a great cost for me to pay by pursuing what I thought was true and what I thought was going to allow me to discover who I was and take a path that was very different than the one I was being told I should take. Among, the one that my investors told me I should take, which is basically to pump up the value of my company. And my fellow entrepreneurs who thought that I was crazy because I decided that I needed to go back and read and spend less time, coding and running my companies, and more time just kind of drinking of some wisdom that I thought I needed in order to kind of, in order to evolve, in order to evolve as an entrepreneur. And it was a very lonely place to be in, when I had this conviction that there was a path that I needed to walk, and I didn't have a lot of support for walking it. I mean, the mentors that I went to told me that I was kind of crazy. And I decided to take a little sabbatical and step away. and do some really hard work and try to get to the bottom of what had been driving me. And I was frankly discouraged from doing that. So, one of the important things I've learned in life is you almost have to filter feedback. Like be careful, because not everybody's necessarily looking out for your best interest. And you have to be able to kind of parse out, everybody has opinions, everybody has advice. And if you start listening to too much of it, you don't actually do the thing that you need to do. So in my case, it was painful and it was lonely. But it led me over the course of, it didn't happen right away, but it led me over the course of, years, roughly 5 years, to come out the other side, just with a much more grounded, with a better understanding of kind of who I wanted to be as an entrepreneur, who is interested in ideas more than I think the average entrepreneur is, who's interested in, how can I really build things that are good for the human person, that lead to human flourishing, and there are trade-offs involved in that, right? There are certain companies I think that might be able to, give me a quicker hit, and a quicker profit. But I'm interested in building things for the long term that contribute to a real healthy human ecology. So it's one thing to kind of, play the role of a contrarian. It's another thing to actually have to do some things that, and make some sacrifices that hurt.
I thought of this where you talk about, if you think about most things we end up doing in life, we're copying or we're imitating, as you say, but we fall into them. And you say most of our desires are like rom-com love. We fall into them. We fall into love rather than choose it. And you highlight here that in every language in the world, people fall in love. Nobody rises up to it. And that's a really important point in a mimetic sense. So this concept of mimesis, because this mimesis is actually what changed your whole world, but it also changed Gerard's life in the 50s, Thiel's, as you mentioned, in the 80s, and yours in the noughties. And it's this thing called mimetic desire. So to give our audience some context, I'd love if you brought us through this great discovery that you had.
So, that idea that we fall in love, in almost every language in the world, that's the language used to describe that process. The reason that's important is that it's getting to the heart of desire, right? I mean, love is about desire, and I think that the romantic lens here is actually a really good one to use. Why is it that we just can fall head over heels in love with another person in a romantic way? But not just romantically. We can just become, some people have gravitas and we're just attracted to them. And we don't often pause and ask why. And I think that line about, falling, nobody rises up into it. It's getting at, there's some force, there's some force out there that we often don't understand, that it obviously exerts a huge effect on us as human beings, where we can rush headlong into new jobs. We can fall in love with them, right? Just like we can with people. And then we're surprised when sometimes, the love, so to speak, or the desire goes away. And Gerard's insight is that because the fundamental nature of desire is mimetic, the vast majority of things that we pursue, objects that we desire, there is some model that is exerting an influence on us in some way. And often that model of desire is hidden. It's hidden from us. And if we don't know who the model is, then we're totally surprised, right? If we think that desire just happens spontaneously and we don't have an awareness of this, then we're like totally surprised and it feels like whiplash. So let me just give you kind of a couple examples. Gerard made his fundamental discovery of mimetic desire by reading literature. He read classic literature. And Stendhal, Dostoevsky, Cervantes, a lot of French literature, because Gerard was French, so a lot of classical French literature, The Red and the Black. And he noticed that the characters in these stories never spontaneously desire anything. So in these great works of literature, they're so realistic to us and they resonate so much with us because they're getting at something true about how desire works. Now, whether these authors realize it explicitly or not is not the point. The point is that they created characters whose desires seem to be shaped by other characters. In other words, desire is relational. So it doesn't, like, my desire is not generated from within me like ex nihilo out of nothing. The desire is generated based on relationships with other people. And he saw that this happens in those novels. So there's characters, right? Like Don Quixote reads this tale, is sitting alone in his room about this knight. And all of a sudden he wants to become the knight errant, and he does. So, and he sort of found this pattern endures across all of these works of literature. And then, of course, he said, I wonder if this is getting at something true. So he looked in the culture, he looked into history, he looked everywhere, and he found the phenomenon of mimetic desire like everywhere he looked. And then he looked inside of himself, and he's like, yeah, this is true. If I'm really honest with myself, this is what's going on in my life. And one of the stories that he told, he recalled this time that I can relate to this incident where, in his 20s when he was a student, he started dating a woman and started to fall in love with her. And she asked him to marry her, and it kind of spooked him out a little bit. And he withdrew himself and said, I'm not ready for that. And he backed away. But as soon as a week or two later, I don't have all the details of the story because he was a little vague in the way that he told it. Another man comes on the scene, and, she starts dating other guys, and they're expressing interest in her. And he said, all of a sudden, I was just immediately drawn back to her in this irresistible way, because now I had other models of desire. And he realized that, in a way, his desire was on this kind of ebb and flow according to the different relationships and the way that they were affecting his desire. And he realizes that he had to kind of gain some distance from that so that he could see it for what it was. And this happens all the time in our lives, right? I mean, we think about even trivial things like, the attractiveness of a shirt in a store when there's 100 shirts that look alike, and then we have our cool friend go and start, picks out one and just was crazy about it. And all of a sudden that shirt takes on an added desirability, right, that it didn't have before. So this happens across all different kinds of domains in life. And I think getting at the hidden models are important, because if we don't know the hidden models, first of all, we're more easily manipulated through everything from advertisements to just bad actors and sort of people that maybe they've never heard the term mimetic desire before, but they still know how it works and they still play the games, right? And also it gives us more intentionality. Like if we know who's influencing us in these ways, we're not so surprised when we have these fluctuations like this.
You started my work on it, man, and I wanted to thank you because I hadn't heard of mimetic desire before. I hadn't heard of mimesis, haven't heard of Girard. So I learned so much from the book, but also I've started my own process of looking at what my models are, because I probably don't have typical models. As I don't watch TV actually because I prefer to read, so I watch very little TV. So I kind of avoid stuff like the news and the newspapers and stuff. I'm aware of what's going on, but probably if there was a nuclear war today, I would have no idea because I haven't checked out the news all day. Yeah, I'd be a goner. I'd be like, or else I'd just walk out and go, "Where is everybody?" And there's hazmat suits everywhere. Bit too close to the current day. But I thought about something you said, because you talked there about Girard's story of chasing the girl. I loved in the book you talk about the cat and the attitude of the cat, and you're like kind of go to brush the cat and the cat's like tail in the air, butt in the air, kind of like, I'm too cool for you, and you're like going, I really want to rub the cat now. But I thought then as well what you talk about beautifully, and I loved your YouTube videos as well, the one about the toddlers in a playroom, and if one of the kids, so they all have equal toys, but they'll eventually converge around one toy based on who shows that toy the most attention. I thought that was fascinating because this is the origin of it.
Yes. So if you put a bunch of toddlers in a room with toys, one of them, for whatever reason, will pick up the shiny red fire truck and start playing with it and show this fascination with it. And maybe it's just because, she loves the color red, or, her dad's a fireman or whatever. Okay. So there may not have been a model for that particular, attraction. Right. But depending on who she is, depending on the level of desire that she shows for this, and, the fuss she makes over the toy, sure enough, the other kids will begin to converge on the single toy. And there's only one toy, and there are 3, 4, 5 kids, and the more kids come over, right, the more that there's some object of fascination. This is the way that we operate, right? Like if you see if you're walking down the sidewalk and you see a bunch of people that are just like huddled around, like watching something, and they're just like wide-eyed and have looks of amazement on their face, we can hardly resist walking over there to see what they're looking at. I mean, I think we both lived in New York, and this happens all the time. And maybe there's like some breakdancers doing some really cool stuff, or an artist, and we're just generally attracted. Like that desire is contagious. And this is Girard's insight, is that desire works by contagion and it works by imitation. So, 3, 4, 5 children will come huddle around that toy. And the more there are, the easier it is for the next one to join. But again, there's only one toy. So Girard's insight, the next step here in this process of thinking about mimetic desire is, well, what if desire is mimetic? Well, what does that mean? Well, the logical consequence is that this is perhaps the root of conflict and tension in humans and in our culture. Because we're desiring mimetically this one thing, and now we've just made ourselves, in essence, a rival to the other person who's pursuing it. The other girl who's holding the truck in her hands. And you watch the toddlers, and many times they start fighting over the toy. And it's like, what are you doing? There's like 100 toys in this room, but everybody wants the one toy. And the more that they want it, the more it increases the desire for it, right? So like the denial of, like, when we can't get something, it just makes us want it even more. That's why people play hard to get, because there's like something very true in that. It's like something about human nature, like makes desire is like inversely correlated, right, with the ease with which something is to get. So I think like Girard's insight is that mimetic desire explains why we get drawn into kind of unnecessary competition and rivalry and conflict. So while the toddler story is kind of fun, there's actually kind of a dark side to it. I mean, it's harmless with the toddlers, but we also have to realize that this behavior is actually in us too. And as adults, we're not fighting over a little shiny red toy. We might be fighting over job positions or popularity or spouses or whatever.
I found this really interesting in, if you think about friends, say for example, Luke and Aidan go to the same school, grow up together. We both go our separate ways. You become a founder. I go and I work for the man, right? I work in a legacy organization. But then I decide, actually, I'm going to go out and do my own thing and do a startup. And actually, it's going to be in the same field as you. You have one already in health and nutrition. I'm going to do one too, man. And all of a sudden, the hairs on the back of your neck start to rise, and you're like kind of going, shit, what if he's good at it? What's he doing invading my space here? And then you're kind of not that supportive of me all of a sudden. And I thought about that, Luke, bringing it into many of the organizations you and I work with, the type of organizations trying to change the mindset, because they have a very competitive internally mindset more than externally. So they compete more with the guy or girl up the hall than they do with an external competitor. And you said that those who want the same things are willing to destroy one another to get them, even if it means destroying themselves in the process. People don't fight because they're different. They fight because they want the same things. That spoke to me in so many ways. I thought of industries such as the media industry, for example. I worked in it, and I often thought about the newspapers, that if they collaborated and created a universal search engine amongst themselves, they would do better, and then they could, not have access from Google, and therefore they wouldn't have bundled or atomized their content. And then I also thought about, what Steve Jobs did with the iTunes store, is that the labels couldn't collaborate, but they'd rather fight with each other And then along comes somebody who actually offers a common platform. And because they're not seen as a competitor, they go and they work towards that. There's a lot in that to unbundle, but that really dawned on me when I read this passage.
Yeah, we've heard the saying, familiarity breeds contempt. But I would say in Girard's language, that similarity breeds contempt too. It's the people that are more similar to us that are more of a threat to us, who are more likely to become models of desire and rivals. So it's like you are playing rugby and you're an athlete. And people that are in the business world or your friends that you grew up with, you just win, you live a different life. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, you're not an athlete anymore. Now you're in the business world. And I've experienced this in my life too, right? It's like in a company, somebody all of a sudden moves into my department and I have my perception of them totally changes, where like, before it was like Steve and, he works in this totally separate division of the company with totally different goals and incentives and bonus pools. And, we could go out for drinks after work and have a great time and chat, but all of a sudden, when he's rising up the ranks and he moves into my division of the company, now, like, I'm a little careful of what I share with him when we go out for beers after work.
If you go for a beer at all.
Yeah, man. If we do at all, right? So like this happens all the time. And this is related to something that Girard said about two different kinds of models. There are models that are outside of our world because they're in a different part of the company. They're just in a different lifestyle or career, because they're dead, because they're fictional, right? Just in some way, there's just some kind of a barrier that exists between us and them. And they're not threatening to us. And these go by many names. We role models, right? Children have role models. These are obviously people that are outside of their world. But then the other kind of model is what Girard says, we almost never realize. And he says these are the ones that are inside of our world. And he calls them internal mediators of desire. It's an academic phrase. Internal mediators, and by the word internal, he just means like they're inside of our own world, and yet they're affecting our desires, right? They're mediating desire to us for different things, different interests, different opportunities, and those are the really hard ones to understand. And people can move, as we just talked about, right, from one of those worlds to the other one, from outside to inside, or from inside to outside. And, this is a really important dynamic to understand. So as I was learning about mimetic theory, this distinction between the two worlds and the two different kinds of models was one of the most important things for me to grasp. Because I was like, it's really easy for me to like point to people out there, that I really admire, that I want to emulate. But like, it's a lot harder to kind of like notice like people that are kind of, closer to me, that are affecting me in various ways. Maybe just people I follow on Twitter even, right? Like, and just like having an awareness about how they're affecting me is really important.
I found that piece so useful, man, for personally, for really, as I use that word, sculpting away at myself to go, why are you doing this? Like, it really helps you uncover purpose. And I do executive coaching. I know you do coaching in companies as well. And the idea of finding out, well, what's the desire behind that? Who's the model? Who are you either trying to impress or emulate in some way is really, really useful. But I find through that work that many people don't want to do that. They actually want to jump to goals and achieve the vision. And they're kind of going, yeah, but I want to achieve my vision. You're kind of going, but why? Because you need to understand the desire behind it. You need to understand the purpose behind it, because that will help you make better decisions as you navigate towards your vision.
We're incarnate creatures. We're bodily and we're physical. And maybe it's just because I'm pretty like Aristotelian here, but I think it's really important for us to have like really concrete models. And I think that we all do. This is a better way to put it. And if people have this abstract vision or abstract idea of who they want to be or what their career to look like or what they want it to look like, I often push them, like, well, who might embody some of that, right? And like who's a person? And some people are resistant to do that. Well, like my vision's totally different. There's nothing out there that exists like that. I'm like, well, maybe that's true. So let's do an amalgamation of different models, right? Like take a trait from this person, trait from this person. You go anybody in history, right? Like let's begin to like think seriously about like what it is. I think that's a really important process to go through because we really need the concrete, and sometimes I think we fool ourselves with higher and higher levels of abstraction. Yet, we're very incarnate creatures, and those concrete examples, especially the ones that are really close to us, exert a massive influence on us.
It's funny. I thought about that. One of the people I write about in my book is Arnold Schwarzenegger, and the reason is one of the things was his vision was so clear, and it was literally written for him as a 13-year-old when he discovered a magazine cover with this guy Reg Park, who had become the youngest ever Mr. Universe, who went on to be an actor. Sound familiar? And he read this and he was like, "Oh, I'm going to do that." And what I loved about was the clarity of vision for him as a child. Now, I thought then about in sport, and this is no disrespect to sports players, is that often if you're not the greatest thinker, you can often be a much better player because it's instinctive, it's internal navigation, right, of the pitch or the football field, whatever it is, because you're not thinking and you're not overthinking. And I thought about that when you talked about the abstraction. Oftentimes we do that to ourselves when we're trying to go for a vision that's more quantum of a vision. It's not really fully formed yet. We're still forming it. And we tried then to jump straight to how do we get there, a kind of a Newtonian world, which is actually very physical. And in doing that, we break the vision because we're like too much into the center. And this is what you're saying, is that we overcomplicate things.
I mean, this is great. So maybe this explains why I was never that great of an athlete. I could tell my friends I was just a really great thinker. I just was too good of a thinker.
That's what I tell myself.
Why I couldn't have
I hope I've given you a model here. Right, this show's over.
That's a great insight. But I think it's true. I think it's true in sports, and I think it's true in so many domains of life. Though, I mean, when it comes to like, let's take business. We at a certain level, I spent most of my time in the startup world, right? And at a certain level, there's not much of a place for thinking too much about big ideas or reading a lot of books because it's a hustle culture. You got to be working 80 to 90-hour weeks. Like, who the hell has time to be reading like classical philosophy and René Girard?
Yeah, wuss. Luke's lost it, man. He's reading some Girard guy.
Well, no, you get no cred for that in the world that I come from, because there is like the idea of doing. Action is what's valuable. Like constantly be building the valuation. What use does this wisdom have? Right? I mean, this is one of the issues. I mean, it doesn't have a lot of like real immediate reward in the worldly sense in terms of like increasing my salary or the value of my company by like understanding right some of these concepts. I mean, I'll argue that it long term this is a very good thing and that it does help in so many different ways. But short term, it's not always clear. And there is that sense that sometimes like the best business people, the best entrepreneurs are those who like are kind of more like the great athlete, right? That are just able to kind of operate on instinct and go. And the danger there is not realizing the different forces that are still at work. And because we're going so fast and so hard, and we don't take any time for reflection and introspection, we think of ourselves as so independent, and we're our own men, and we're free thinkers and all of this stuff. It's almost like the more that we believe that, right? This is Girard calls it the romantic lie. The more susceptible we can be to getting drawn into the kinds of things that we've been talking about.
Luke, I was thinking here about how mimetic desire brings us together, but then you say it then pushes us apart, almost like Girard chasing after the lady who's playing hard to get, but when he gets there and he kind of loses interest once he has her in his grasp again. if nobody else has shown attention to her. But you talk also about, if we understand this, we can also harness it. And you mentioned earlier on Peter Thiel. He was also somebody you interviewed for the book and got to know quite well. But he was a student of Girard, and his understanding of mimetic desire has given him a superpower in his world of investment. It's why he invested in Facebook. I'd love if you brought us through that. But then also that he realized when they formed PayPal between him and Musk, that actually fighting each other was going to destroy them. Actually, if they collaborated, they could build something meaningful, which became PayPal.
This is there's a positive sense and a negative sense to which we can harness mimetic desire in positive and I would call preventative ways. So in the positive sense, every company in a way has to harness mimetic desire for whatever it's doing. That's really the only way to grow quickly. So one of my favorite thinkers out there in the VC entrepreneurship world is Gary Tan of Initialized Capital. And he's kind of fond of saying that, like, today every company is a meme. Like every company has to create some meme in order to kind of replicate and to grow. And Gary and I had a conversation and kind of came to this understanding and agreement that, well, in fact, every company has to be mimetic and learn how to kind of harness the power of mimetic desire so that, they can create a ripple effect. Like, one person's desire for this product or service, is contagious and leads to other people becoming interested in it and having the same desire. And companies can be intentional about accelerating mimetic desire for things like this is basic, right? Like making things easily shareable, incentivizing, people to express their desire for whatever the thing is. And Peter Thiel realized very quickly that, Facebook was essentially an engine of mimetic desire. The way that Facebook works, it's if your friends want to be on Facebook, it just grows exponentially. And very importantly, Facebook started out at prestigious college campuses in the US, at Harvard, and then it very selectively went to other college campuses. And this is the key point about why I think Peter Thiel saw the power of Facebook. It wasn't just like indiscriminately generating mimetic desire. It was generating mimetic desire inside of these very specific closed environments where there was a high degree of similarity. This is the world. Man, we talked about the two different worlds. There's the external world and the internal world. The internal one I call freshmanistan because it's kind of like being a freshman in high school or college. So Facebook was going into these little worlds, these little college campuses. And that's a powerful thing, man. I mean, you get 5-10% of your class wanting to be on Facebook, and the other ones just can't stand it. And Facebook, they showed these crazy, freakish numbers where, like, within just a couple of months of being on a campus, they had like some crazy, like 90% plus adoption rate. And that's the power of mimetic desire within the world where everybody's very similar. And Facebook was able to take that to their investors. I mean, that's like a no-brainer, right? You show that kind of adoption and power. So Thiel saw that, and he said, I bet on mimesis. Like I understood mimetic desire and the way that this works. And it helped him see why Facebook was going to be so powerful. On the flip side, when Thiel started PayPal, he saw that mimetic desire was working in the negative sense, where now you have people inside the same company who are competing over the same, prestigious titles and the same tasks. And he saw that, a lot of this rivalry, a lot of the competition inside of PayPal in the early days was driven through mimetic rivalry. It was mimetic rivalry. And again, because he had this mental model, he had this framework, and he was like, oh, like these guys are just attracted to doing this one thing because the other one is, and the more the other one wants it, the more the other one, and they're just like reinforcing, this desire for this thing that actually doesn't even matter for the success of the company. and he took steps because he saw that. He took steps to diffuse and prevent the rivalry. He gave everybody very specific tasks to do. He made sure that he just eliminated the possibility for people to do that as much as possible.
I love that, man. I really, if you think of Facebook first, it's a scalable digital version of keeping up with the Joneses. If the data is played out that way. So like you say, I live next door to you. In the past, you're Luke Jones, and and my wife looks over and goes, "Oh, the Joneses got a new lawnmower," and straight away I kind of go, "Does that mean she wants us to have a new lawnmower?" and the modern version is today is like going, "Oh, I see the Joneses, the Burgesses are going on holidays to Hawaii," and I'm going, "Oh, does that mean she wants holiday?" And then all of a sudden that's in, and then it becomes this kind of, because it's localized as well, but in a virtual world. But I wanted to take that because you beautifully go back to the origins of this. And I didn't know it was, it was probably always there, this whole idea of some type of PR in some sense as we evolved throughout the ages. But you talk about Bernays and the origin of PR, and you tell us that Bernays seem to understand that desire requires models. And you talk here about the origins of making smoking sexy for women. This really encapsulated for me. This was a great model for me to get my head around.
So the story of Eddie Bernays is fascinating. Eddie Bernays, cut his teeth in the early 20th century, got his start around 1919, and is really considered the father of modern day PR. He was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, and integrated a lot of ideas of Freudian psychology into his work. And by the way, when he kind of invented this field of what we know as modern day public relations, he didn't call it public relations. He called it propaganda. And that's the name of one of Eddie Bernays' books. And in the late 20s, he was hired. He just became a master at basically organizing public campaigns on behalf of entities, on behalf of the U.S. government to drum up support for World War I, on behalf of American pork companies to get people to eat more bacon at breakfast. And every time he would engage in one of these campaigns, he would always have the tactic of like finding, models to be able to, like a doctor in the case of why you should eat more bacon at breakfast, right? And like people really listen to these people. So he kind of inherently knew that in order to generate the kind of interest and desire in something, he needed models. The most famous and interesting story is the way that Bernays was hired by the American Tobacco Company to try to encourage more women to smoke. So, a lot of, young American men went away to World War I and, the horrors of war. They actually included cigarettes in their rations. And, many men took up smoking during the war. So fast forward to the 1920s in the US, a lot of men smoked, but not many women smoked. It was totally taboo for them to smoke in public. So this was a manly activity, like men would make fun of women that smoked in public. And American Tobacco Company was like, well, how do we break this taboo? How do we get more women to smoke, right? They saw this as a massive profit potential. And they hired Bernays. And the tactic that he took, in my view, is he hacked mimetic desire in a sense. And I'll tell you how he did it, because I think this story really brings everything together. He, at the time, and this is 1929, when Bernays was hired by the American Tobacco Company, maker of Lucky Strikes, Bernays wanted to try to get as many women to smoke Lucky Strikes as possible. And the most important event that happened every year in New York City was the Easter Day Parade in 1929. I mean, it was the equivalent of the Super Bowl in 1929. Like everybody paraded down Fifth Avenue. They came out of the church in the morning and just wore their best outfits, and they paraded down Fifth Avenue, and all eyes were on them. And he realized that this was the opportunity that he'd been waiting for. Like this was the Super Bowl. So he really wanted to use this to stage some event that would help, break the taboo of women smoking in public. So what he did is he very meticulously and carefully recruited 10 very, very good-looking, well-dressed women, some fashion models. One of them was a secretary, to be planted at various places along the route of the Easter Day parade in 1929. He gave them all packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes that they had hidden somewhere on them. And he had all kinds of cues and signals ready to go. So at a given time, when they got the cue, they would whip out the Lucky Strike cigarettes and they would strut down Fifth Avenue and just light right up. And he even had journalists and reporters ready to take pictures, ready to go the moment that they lit up. And it was orchestrated in such a way that they looked like they didn't know each other, that it looked like this was happening totally spontaneously, right? Now remember, the romantic lie, is that our desires are totally spontaneous. But what Girard did is he knew that that's not true. So he was providing models of desire, models of smoking, women that seemed like they were spontaneously deciding to just break the taboo, screw it, I'm just going to light up. And they all did it around the same time. And sure enough, that action was, contagious. Other women began to light up and say, well, she's doing it, I'm going to do it too. And this was an act of defiance against the taboo. This was an act of defiance against all the men that told them that they shouldn't be smoking in public. And not that many smoked in private even, but especially in public. And sure enough, the next day, the headlines, also carefully orchestrated by Bernays himself, were torches of freedom. The women are smoking torches of freedom, plastered across all the major newspapers in the U.S., went syndicated. And that was a meme phrase that took off. Like, who doesn't want to be on the side of freedom, right? You're against freedom. Nobody wants to be against that. Just a genius move from a PR standpoint. I mean, never mind the kind of manipulation that was going on. And that within the next 10 years, a massive amount of women began smoking. And there was this contagion of desire because now there was a model. And Bernays had carefully held these models up for the world to see. And that's all it really took. The power of a model, we can never underestimate that. Like, what are the odds that all of these people would independently just make the decision to just take up smoking Lucky Strikes, specifically Lucky Strikes, right? So just a fascinating story, really, of I think how Bernays understood mimetic desire and rivalry and kind of used it to his advantage to get what he wanted.
If you think about the fragmentation in media, and how it would have been easier for Bernays if he knew, for example, everybody watched, Bewitched or some show, the Hulk or something in the 60s. He could target that specific show, so he was guaranteed a mass audience at once. And the fragmentation in media means that people have to go and find these more, but also it means that you can also target a more similar group. And I think that's often overlooked in marketing. It's actually a great gift to understand mimesis, because then you can actually, if you want to use it, I mean, it's like the Force, you can use it for good or otherwise. But former guest of the show, NYU Stern's Scott Galloway, talks about the big four tech companies, and how they tap into a deep-seated need in human desire and human nature. And you put Galloway's ideas into your own words, and I'm going to quote you here, because you say, Google is like a deity that answers our questions, read our prayers. Facebook satisfies our need for love and belonging. Amazon fulfills the need for security, allowing us instantaneous access to goods in abundance. They were there for us during COVID-19 to ensure our survival. And Apple appeals to our sex drive, the need for status, signaling one's attractiveness as a mate by associating a brand that is so innovative and forward-thinking and costly to ourselves. And I loved how you phrased that, and I thought that was certainly worth exploring.
Yeah, I mean, they're tapping into, human desires that we just don't really understand. And I think that's what Scott's work is kind of all about, right? He's sort of getting under the surface layers of why we think that we want these things, and if you ask most people why they buy an Apple product, I mean, I'm on a MacBook right now, and I have all kinds of Apple products. We typically give, the specs and the qualities and, why the processor's better and all of these things. somewhat related to Simon Sinek's work, right? Like it's actually appealing to something much deeper than that. And, I have sort of viewed all of this from the lens of mimetic desire and the way that, not understanding our desires and the nature of them and how they work, like Bernays did. I mean, it leaves us sort of like more susceptible to, to just getting pulled into these deep relationships with various brands without understanding the forces at work underneath it for why.
I wanted to move on to a really important aspect for this show, because you talked a lot about scapegoats, and Girard does as well. And I'd love to share deeper about this, because I often think about how the idea of chaos and order. So K-Order, we've had D Hawk on the show. We did a 7-part series with us. He introduced the idea of K-Order, that everything kind of is in this spiral of chaos, then order, then chaos, then order. And I thought about that when mimetic desire does that, where it kind of brings people together, then they compete, and then it breaks them up again. And you talk about this, that often a way to save the society is to create a scapegoat. I often think about that movie. I don't know if you've seen Wag the Dog with Robert De Niro, Dustin Hoffman.
I haven't seen it.
Oh man, you will love it, because essentially they create a war from a made up country, and they have a whole director, etc. Woody Allen's in it as well. It's fantastic. It's very hard to get because it's so realistic in its story, but it's essentially that things are so chaotic. The president is accused of some negative affairs, and then there's a distraction, and it creates this outside war that brings us closer together. And I thought about the scapegoat there, because the same thing happens in large organizations with innovators and change makers and catalysts. Oftentimes, the place is all fighting. It's silo versus silo. An innovator or a head of innovation or some type of change maker comes in, and they start to mediate things, start to bring them together. But then they become the threat. And then the silos turn on the change maker. And oftentimes the change maker is the scapegoat. That'll tee you up nicely for introducing the scapegoat. And you dedicate a lot of time to this, as does Girard. It's such an important aspect.
Yeah, it's so important to understand. The scapegoat mechanism is a key part of mimetic theory. And traditionally, and Girard was a historian, and he just noticed that time and time again, the way that societies in chaos resolve their chaos is by finding somebody, usually an outsider, to transfer all of the blame to and expel or kill and just get rid of in some way. And this he calls the scapegoat mechanism. And the reason that it has worked as kind of a social innovation, as bad as it is, as terrifying as it is, the functional purpose of creating scapegoats is to unite people who were formerly kind of just in a rivalrous mimetic relationship. So rather than facing each other and facing off against each other, they're able to kind of unite and turn and all focus their attention on one person or on one country, on whatever it is that's being a group that's being blamed. And it allows them to kind of transfer their tensions and their aggression onto a single person or group that absorbs it and absolves them of the responsibility of actually doing anything about it, and directs the conflict and the problem onto one person who has to bear the brunt of it. Okay, and maybe that person is fired, that person is blamed. Sports teams do this all the time. Like one player or one coach is let go. And there's like a math to this, right? Like then the math is better that, the infection get channeled into one person and one person has to deal with it than having, 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 sort of infected, so to speak. So it's a way to kind of take this infection, put it all into one person, and then the people have the illusion that they've identified the problem and they're rooted out, And it gives them this brief moment of unification because they all agree on the problem. And by the way, that agreement happens mimetically too. So the very choice of the scapegoat happens through the kind of contagion of consensus, because nobody's willing to speak up and say, oh, actually, it might not be that person. Because once 100 or 200 people all seem like they're on the same page, it's really scary. It's really hard to be the one to speak up and say, no, maybe we need to do some self-examination. So it unifies them. It brings a moment of catharsis. It feels really good to feel like you've identified the problem. But it's illusory. And it provides temporary peace, but then the cycle starts right back over again because the root problem was never actually addressed. And when I look at businesses, when I'm talking to companies, everybody wants a scapegoat. I mean, come in from the outside and they kind of want to be told, like, here's the very specific problem, do this one thing, get rid of this, person or this department, and then all will be well. Nobody really wants to confront some of the more structural things, the toxic relationships or cultural things that take more time, frankly, to work through and might involve a little bit of pain to kind of work through in the long term. Because scapegoats are just the easy solution. And humans have used the scapegoat mechanism in horrific ways throughout history. And, we see it on a micro level in our lives. We see it on social media. We see it within companies. And just being aware that it's our go-to method for resolving chaos and conflict, that is important. Because we can realize when we ourselves are getting caught up in that tendency to just shift the blame to somebody else.
Gave me a great mental model for understanding some phenomenon. Like, for example, I mentioned media there. Media should have, for years before a Google ever appeared or a Facebook started offering, advertising and started selling audience back to the media channels, that they should have come together and they should have worked together, because this was an inevitable chaos that was going to happen. And they should have brought order before the chaos ever happened. And what they do now is they blame Facebook and Google for stealing all their revenue. So they have, in a way, something to have as a common enemy. So it brings them together, and then they create new alliances, etc., that they should have done long before. The same with Spotify, for example. Spotify in the early days wasn't really a threat, so everybody took their eye off it. The labels should have came together and created their own version, but they wouldn't work together. And then Spotify only starts to take off when the labels invest in Spotify. I think those kind of models are really useful, using your framework, which was so helpful for me. But I really wanted to share one story, and I'd love you to go deep into this one, perhaps as our last story, because you say the contagion of desire isn't always a bad thing. When mimetic desire grows strong enough, there is always a pivotal point. It can go in one of two directions. It can either become a cycle of positive desire, in which healthy desires gain momentum and leads to other healthy desires which unite people in positive ways, or it can feed into a negative cycle of destructive desire, in which mimetic rivalries lead to conflict. And here you describe the brilliant story of Ferrari versus Lamborghini. Many people won't know this story. I think it's a beautiful one, and I loved how you framed it for the book.
I am a big fan of both vehicles, actually. I've never drove either one, but I do think they're beautiful. Now they've become kind of these, symbols of status and luxury. But there's actually a wonderful backstory to how Lamborghini came to be in the first place. Ferrari has been around long before Lamborghini, and had this reputation of, being the best racing cars. And Ferruccio Lamborghini was just a tractor maker in Italy in the early part of the 20th century. And it grew a very successful tractor business. I think the Lamborghini was the number one selling tractor in all of Italy. He became a successful businessman and bought himself a Ferrari. And I think he had a couple Ferraris, actually, and lived not far from where the Lamborghini factory was. And he took his Ferrari out for spins and kept having problems with the clutch. He would throw out the clutch all the time, and then he'd have to go get it repaired. And to get it repaired, he'd have to take it to the Ferrari factory. They would charge him an arm and a leg and give him a new clutch. And 6 months later, the clutch would be burnt again, and he'd have to go get a new one. So he finally got totally fed up with this. He took it back to his tractor factory, and he had his engineers open the hood finally of this car and try to get to the bottom of it. And they found out that Ferrari was using the same clutch that he was in his tractors, and that the clutch just what didn't fit the car, and he was overcharging him for the clutch. So Lamborghini took up one of the best clutches that he had for his biggest tractor. It was a little more sturdier, and he put it in the car. And you take it out racing against the Ferrari drivers that used to test their cars on the track near the factory. And he souped up his car a little bit. So his Ferrari ended up beating the Ferrari straight out of the factory. So he'd already worked on his car and turned it into a better one. And he just couldn't help himself. He had to go tell Ferrari what he thought and tell him about this problem with the clutches. So he finally gets an audience with the great Enzo Ferrari. And Ferrari, tells Lamborghini that, well, he just doesn't know how to drive a Ferrari probably. And that's the reason he kept breaking the clutches. And, he should just stick to making tractors. So Lamborghini left the office and he said, damn it. That's the fire that I needed in order to do something about this problem. Right. So Lamborghini decided to get into the car business, and he said, I'm going to make a car. And I'm going to make Ferrari was just known primarily as a racing car. It wasn't really a touring car, the kind of car that you'd want to take long road trips with, that you could throw luggage in the back seat of or in the trunk. Lamborghini said, I'm going to combine the power and performance of a Ferrari with the luxury of a world-class touring car. And I'm going to make it beautiful, and I'm going to make it perform even better. And it was the rivalry. I mean, frankly, it was just the rivalry with Enzo Ferrari that drove him to have the desire to start a car company in the first place. The thought hadn't crossed his mind until he himself got a Ferrari and started having problems with it. So this was, where Lamborghini was born in the early 60s. And, he produced a car within just a few years. Won all kinds of awards. And, we all know where Lamborghini is today. It's still a heavily sought after vehicle. But the important part about this story is that the rivalry with Ferrari, the mimetic desire, which caused him to want to build a car, was a tremendously positive thing. In the sense that we wouldn't have this car had it not been for that. And it led to innovation. And this is an important thing to realize, that we're mimetic creatures, and mimetic desire is what leads us to it's why we push ourselves, right? When we see somebody performing at a high level, and we desire to do that too. So it's a tremendously positive thing. And as you know, Aidan, I spend a whole second half of the book talking about all of the positive ways that we can live in a world as mimetic people. So, a car was born, a new wonderful company was born out of that desire that was, adopted from Ferrari and the rivalry. But at a certain point, Lamborghini realized that if this whole thing was just about, getting revenge on Enzo Ferrari, that it would end badly. If it just became about the personal rivalry, like, where does that end? Where does it end? I mean, eventually, if Ferrari, wins a race, then Lamborghini has to win the race. And it just becomes like an infinite game of one-upmanship and destructive rivalry. And he would just forget what he was interested in the first place, which was just in creating this new kind of high-performance, beautiful vehicle that, you could go on long road trips with. So the mimetic desire can lead to tremendous things. It can lead us to innovate, but we just have to be able to draw the line between the positive and the negative. And Lamborghini was eventually able to realize that all of his people in the company were kind of pushing him to enter all the races. And like, damn it, we can beat Ferrari in the races. Today it's like Formula One. I don't really know what it was called back then. Yeah. But Lamborghini said no, because that that is a game that never ends. And Lamborghini, being a huge fan of bullfighting his whole life, said, if I do that, and his nickname was the Bull, basically. And he said, if I do that, I will become like the bull, and the bull always dies in the end. Really from pure exhaustion, right? Just from pure exhaustion of constantly chasing the next thing. And I just thought that was a beautiful imagery of what kind of the mimetic rivalries and models can become for us, because there's no end. There's always another one. There's always another thing to do. And the self-awareness of Lamborghini to sort of see himself as the bull, and realizing that wasn't going to ultimately lead him to a fulfilling end to his life. He opted out of that game, and they focused on their cars. They didn't enter the racing circuit for a while. He retired to a beautiful, he started his own vineyard, still around to this day, which you can visit in Italy. I lived there for a few years, but unfortunately I didn't make it to Lamborghini's place, and, retired peacefully and proud of his work. And I thought it was a beautiful story that illustrated both the positive aspects of this mimetic drive that got him into the business, and the self-awareness to know like where to draw the line, when to pivot.
Beautiful, man. It's why I wanted to finish on that story. I love how it ends that way, and it's a stepping away from the game, because you see it's going to end badly. And I thought about that. One of the most liberating things for me has stopped caring what people think. Yes, I still want to do a good job when I'm working. Yes, I still want to be friendly and people to get on well with me, but ultimately I'm not judging myself against them in any way, and it's so liberating. And I know you've gone on that journey yourself. Luke, I always pull a quote, an end quote that I love from the book. I've pulled one from me. I'm going to share it, and then I'd love you to close today's show on your message for our audience. Just a reminder for our audience, I have a copy up for grabs. Just sign up to the innovationshow.io newsletter and you'll be in with a chance to win that. Luke, for people who want to find you, find out more about the book, where can they find you?
You can find me at lukeburgis.com. There's a lot of material that didn't make it into the book. It's already a long book. And all of the stuff that I just wasn't able to include is on my website, in my newsletter. So you can find me there. And, please consider buying the book wherever you like to get your books from.
I will close with this quote and then I'll hand over to you, man. So I absolutely love this one. In the positive cycle of desire, people respect the desires of others as they would their own. What's more, they take an active role in collaborating with others to help them achieve their single greatest desire. We are all, in some sense, midwives to the greatest desires of our neighbours. The simplest definition of love is wanting the good of another. Italians have a way of saying, I love you, that is particularly instructive. Ti voglio bene. They say it means I want your good. I want what's best for you. We have a responsibility to shape our own desires. As we've seen, we can't do that without others. That sounds like I said others and a cow. I'll say that again. As we've seen, we can't do that without others. The duty to shape our desires goes hand in hand with the responsibility to care for the relationships that we have with others. I absolutely loved that, and I thought it was a lovely way to finish today's show. What's the message you'd like to leave? You wrote this book for a purpose. Yes, it was a voyage of self-discovery, but what is the message you wanted to get across?
The message has to do with our shared responsibility and respect for other people, frankly. And I've learned that so much of kind of our modern individualism ends up turning into one person trying to impose their will on another person. And, not really, we have this idea that the primacy of our own desires, and, that's the most important thing in life, is to be able to get what we want, come hell or high water. And even if we're willing to take shortcuts and to sacrifice the desires of other people in order to get what we want. And that mentality is a zero-sum game, right? It's a zero-sum game. And I've seen this in every place that I've ever worked. We see this in politics. We see this in so many companies where, we're imposing our will, and our will is powerful. And it's a beautiful thing, but other people have them too. Other people have desires too. And in my life, there's been this great sort of, paradox and something that took me many, many years to learn. And it's that as leaders, as what I call in the book, transcendent leaders, as people, as for me, as a husband and, soon to be a father.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Not yet. We're getting there. We're not pregnant yet, but I just know I expect it to be coming up soon. There's this awesome responsibility that we have as people and so satisfying and fulfilling to focus more on helping other people cultivate their own desires, to identify and discern and fulfill them, right? So there's this outward turn, whether that's my wife, whether that's my colleague, my students, because I teach, junior people at my company. That's why I think mentorship is so powerful, right? It fulfills this fundamental human responsibility that we have to help other people kind of fulfill their own desires. And then in doing so, oddly, paradoxically, we end up kind of coming to fulfill our own. So it's this total shift away from, thinking about myself and my own desires. That's the one thing that I would love people to come away with this book with, that, desire ultimately is kind of another word for love. And, if we take it far enough, my book is about love. And sort of there's superficial desires. And then as we begin to understand them more, what we want is what we most love. And, I'm trying to get us to look at business, to get us to look at human relationships as social, and this awesome responsibility. We're all kind of woven together in this web of desire. And, the more that we are consumed with our own desires, the easier it is to forget that. And this has all kinds of ramifications for business, for life in general. And I think, if you stay with me to the end of the book, at least, I think you'll see how mimetic desire is fundamentally about relationships. And whether that's work relationships, personal relationships, romantic relationships, taking the focus away from our own desires onto others opens up this whole universe to us, which can be incredibly powerful, incredibly fulfilling, and allow us to enter into just deeper and more intimate relationships with people that we wouldn't have been able to do that if the focus was on getting what we want.
Beautiful, man. Author of Wanting, The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life, Luke Burgis. Ti voglio bene.
Ti voglio bene. Thanks so much, Aidan.